What if the place in you that aches and hopes is not a narrow room, but a vast country waiting to be inhabited? At the edge of ordinary life, there is a quiet possibility that the heart is not merely a receiver of pleasure and pain, but a hospitable field large enough to hold contradiction, paradox, joy and sorrow without collapsing. Ibn Arabi's saying opens like a door into that possibility, a claim that the interior can expand, not by shrinking the world into comprehension, but by widening to welcome the world in its full, bewildering plurality. Imagine a chamber whose walls dissolve the moment you lean into them. There is no longer a frontier between inside and outside, only a single luminous field where more can arrive and more can be kept without breaking. We are taught to protect the heart as though it were fragile glass, to keep identities tight and borders fortified. This caution breeds a narrowness of living. We welcome what confirms us and repulse what threatens our self-image. But what of strength were not the hardness of refusal, but the spaciousness of reception? A heart that can host all destinies is not passive. It is a living crucible that holds opposites in tension and learns their language. It listens without haste, translates suffering into compassion, and allows delight to pass through without clinging. Such a heart becomes a place where multiplicity is not a threat, but a resource. Consider the metaphor of a harbor. Small harbors shelter only boats of a particular size and draft. Storms easily overwhelm them. A great harbor, however, accommodates vessels of every design. Fragile skiffs, heavy freighters, soaring masts, giving each the room to tie and untie, to rest and to depart. The heart that Ibn Arabi describes is like this great harbor, not indifferent, but capable of receiving many currents and steering them into a larger navigation. It does not mean the inner life becomes indifferent to pain. Rather, pain finds space to speak its truth without being amplified into perpetual enmity. Opening the heart in this way is a practice of paradox. We do not become less ourselves by welcoming the other. We become more ourselves because the self ceases to be an anxious fortress. When a stranger's sorrow is held beside our own, the two sorrows do not annihilate each other. They coalesce into an expanded empathy that changes how we understand suffering. Likewise, joys mirror and multiply. The encounter is not absorption, where one identity swallows another, but a mutual hospitality, where differences are preserved and transformed in the light of shared presence. This capacity grows not through grand gestures, but by small acts of attention. A morning spent listening rather than answering. A moment where judgment is suspended to feel rather than to categorize. A patience with the companion's bafflement. These are the slow tiltings that alter the compass of the heart. Over time, habitual exclusion loosens its grip. The reflex to split the world into friend and enemy weakens, and a subtler taxonomy emerges, one that notices degrees of injury and the potential for repair. Here, ethical perception and ontological openness converge. How we think of hearts shapes what hearts become. There is, of course, a cost to such hospitality. To enlarge the inner room is to invite vulnerability. Unexpected echoes will surface, old griefs will ask to be seen, and old certainties will dissolve. Yet vulnerability is the price of generosity. The brave heart does not armor itself against all hurt. It learns the craft of holding without collapsing, like a basket maker weaving flexible fibers that yield under stress but keep their shape. Strength becomes pliant and responsive, a tensile resilience that sustains breath rather than brittle defense. When the heart becomes capable of all destinies, it also discovers a new ecology of relationship. Boundaries are rethought. They remain, but they are permeable. We no longer mistake permeability for permissiveness. Boundaries continue to protect dignity and integrity while allowing oxygen for coexistence. In this field, the sacred is not distant. It is the texture that transforms ordinary exchanges into sites of presence. The divine is recognized not as a remote ruler, but as the quality that suffuses hospitality, the gravity that draws hosts and guests into a common orbit. And so, the first step is simple and radical: to notice the edges of our heart and to test them with small acts of courage. Invite a contrary story in. Sit with discomfort without making it your whole identity. Let the passive curiosity of a moment open a corridor through which surprise may pass. Each such act is a soft revolution, a slow widening that does not rush, but accumulates until the heart's horizon truly becomes capacious. If the heart can be a harbor, then what will you bring into its waters first? The rawness of an old wound? The unexpected joy you have been guarding? Or the quiet ache of another's life asking for shelter? The harbor you imagined in the first light does not remain a static refuge. It reveals its tides. Where you once pictured calm berths in orderly ropes, you now notice the subtle currents that tug in different directions. Compassion pulling one way, anger another, joy like a sudden wind that lifts a bow. The heart that grows wide enough to hold many destinies is not a passive basin, but a living estuary where rivers of feeling meet and exchange their sediments. To inhabit this estuary is to learn the craft of navigation without a single rigid chart. Begin with the simple fact that opposites do not annihilate each other here. They interpenetrate. Grief and gratitude can occupy the same chamber without canceling one another. An old hurt may flare as an ash-colored tide, while tenderness flows in alongside it like clear water. In that mingling, the contours of self soften. You are neither only the wound nor only the healer, but the waterway that carries both. This is not sentimental harmony. It is a precise capacity to let polarity become texture rather than verdict. The inner horizon expands not by flattening difference, but by making room for its sacred conversation. There is a particular posture the heart must learn, a stance less about clinging and more about bearing. Bear here does not mean to shoulder like a burden, but to hold with steadiness, like a tree whose roots drink from multiple streams, without uprooting. Hospitality of soul requires resilience that is supple rather than armored. When an uneasy truth arrives, that someone we love is also an agent of harm, or that joy and culpability entwine, we do not flee into moral absolutism. Instead, we practice an attentive openness that notices harms, names them, and at the same time refuses to reduce the other into a single headline. The heart's capacity is displayed in that fine balance, to see fully and to hold kindly without collapsing into excuse or erasure. Language plays a decisive role in shaping this capability. The words we offer ourselves set the shorelines of experience. I am angry and I feel anger are not equivalent utterances. The latter creates distance, a space where observation can do its work. Naming becomes a sacrament that clarifies without imprisoning. When we learn to speak of inner states with precision and gentleness, we cease to inflame conflict and begin to craft channels through which understanding travels. Speech, used with care, becomes a method of hosting. It draws boundaries where necessary and opens passages where healing may pass. There is also an economy of discernment at work. A heart large enough to hold all destinies does not mean indiscriminate absorption. Discernment is not a wall, but a set of gates. Some currents are invited in for nurture, Others are redirected, transformed, composted into wisdom. To confuse hospitality with unbounded vulnerability is to mistake generosity for dissoluteness. True openness preserves the integrity of the host. It refuses to be consumed by every incoming tide. This kind of strength is almost invisible. It is a steady thickness that lets softness exist without being devoured. Practices that cultivate such an interior climate are less about mastering techniques and more about rehearsing attention. Small habits accumulate into structures of soul. A habit of pausing before responding loosens reactive scripts. A habit of listening to one's own breath when upset prevents identification with passing storms. Rituals of small, deliberate kindness towards ourselves, acknowledging our limits, giving ourselves permission to rest, reshape the heart's capacity for others. Over time, these micro-choices alter the estuary. Once turbid waters clear, and currents find patterns that sustain rather than erode. Yet, the enlargement of the heart is not merely a personal refinement. It transforms the field in which relationships occur. When two people each offer such space, their shared terrain changes. Arguments become dialogues. Boundaries become an invitation to mutual care. And conflict transforms into an opportunity for deeper knowledge. In communities where hospitality of soul flourishes, the sacred is not a relic kept in temple or text, but the lived quality of everyday exchange. Presence itself becomes liturgy. Listening becomes sacrament. The world begins to look less like a battleground of claims and more like a collaborative experiment in mutual becoming. There is a cost, a practice of unlearning that must accompany any intention to widen. Pride, the need to be right, the habit of swift judgment, these must be set with, witnessed, and gradually loosened. Each relinquishment is not a loss, but a trade, the brittle certainty of being correct exchanged for the pliant wisdom of seeing more. The slow work of unburdening teaches us that the heart's capacity grows not by conquest, but by surrender to relational truth, by the humility of recognizing that we do not hold final claim over meaning. So, the harbor becomes an estuary, the calm replaced by an attentive movement that accommodates many streams. In that movement, the sacred is no longer distant. It is the tender ecology that allows difference to breathe. The question that opens the next horizon is not about ability, but about willingness. Will you learn to tend the gates of your heart so that many destinies may enter and depart without being lost or diminished? Will you learn to tend the gates of your heart so that many destinies may enter and depart without being lost or diminished? The question trails like a gull's cry over the estuary. Now, as evening deepens, the currents settle into a clarity that allows the harbor to reveal its larger shape. What began as a chamber for receiving has, through patient tending and the steady practice of attention, become an arena of initiation, a place where the self is both interior host and witness to a world that arrives in countless guises. The harbor has widened into horizon. Notice how the work of holding alters perception. Where once difference felt like fracture, it now reads as texture. The rough weave of another's grief, the glossy sheen of a stranger's joy, the braided tension of contradiction. None of these need to be smoothed into sameness. Instead, they become notes in a single strange chord that the heart is learning to sound without forcing any one tone to dominate. This chord has no composer outside of you. It is composed in the quiet decisions of how to meet what comes, with attention that is neither clingy nor dismissive, but both soft and firm, like a palm cupping a flame without smothering it. There is a discipline here that is gentle, rather than harsh. It is not the mastery of an iron will, but the cultivation of a steady, hospitable gaze. You practice naming without indictment, holding without absorption, drawing boundaries that are permeable rather than defensive. In doing so, you learn a new grammar of relation. Verbs of reception, listen, receive, stay, become as important as verbs of action. Being entered into this grammar, ordinary life is transfigured. The handshake at a doorway becomes a small liturgy. The scold of a child becomes an oracle demanding translation. An evening quarrel can be a fissure in which truth grows if we do not slam shut the gate at the first tremor. And there is paradox. Expansion demands contraction. To make room for many destinies, you sometimes must prune attachments that masquerade as identity. Letting go of the tidy narrative that has given you shape is not annihilation, but liberation. Emptied spaces make possible new arrivals. The heart's growth is not a spreading that consumes, but a disciplined opening calibrated by discernment. You learn which tides to welcome and which to redirect. How to compost bitterness into soil that nourishes compassion rather than feeding resentment into perpetuity. In the crucible of relationship, this practice shows its weight. When another shadow stirs old storms in you, the hospitable heart does not dissolve into permissiveness, nor erect a fortress of refusal. It meets the shadow with an inquiry that is at once tender and clear. What is being asked here? And what is being triggered by the past? This question becomes a lantern in the dark. It does not answer all mysteries, but it refuses the tyranny of instant reaction. And in that refusal, the possibility of true encounter opens. To hold another's contradiction is not to approve every act, but to refuse the simplistic reduction of person to problem. The sacredness of the heart's field lies not in grand revelation, but in the calibration of daily responsiveness. A pilgrim's progress is tracked less by miraculous visions than by incremental shifts. The breath that returns after a flash of anger, the patience that arrives where haste once ruled, the awkward apology that becomes the hinge of repair. Each small practice is an act of devotion to presence. Each repeated act rearranges the nervous architecture that used to default to defense. Over months and years, the habitual reflexes soften, the heart's elasticity increases, and with it, the capacity to host without being overwhelmed. As the evening deepens into a kind of inner night, an image may settle. A vast plain of water under a slow moon, the harbor lights like patient eyes along the shore. Boats arrive and depart, some laden, some empty. All are welcomed without equalizing their cargo. The heart watches them with a gaze that knows both their stories and the limits of its own hands. This knowing is not mastery, but a reverent competence, a posture that carries humility and responsibility in equal measure. Finally, the transformation we have been tracing completes not by a dramatic consummation, but by a quiet shift in how you move through the world. The boundary between prayer and conversation thins. Work and rest enter a shared gravity. The other is no longer a mirror to be avoided or a trophy to be secured. The other becomes a co-soul whose presence tests and refine your hospitality. In this mutual testing, the divine is recognized not as a distant lawgiver, but as the living quality that animates generous attention. If Ibn Arabi's line is a map, it is drawn not in ink, but in the practice of opening. My heart became capable of all destinies. This is not boast, but report. The observation of a life where the field of presence has been cultivated enough to hold contradiction without fracture, to translate conflict into learning, to let the sacred be the ground of ordinary exchange. The final image is simple and stubbornly quiet. A heart that is, like a harbor at dawn, full of arrivals and departures, steady beneath the passage of tides, offering birth to all without losing its own shape. Let that image settle. The harbor lights breathing in and out, the moon listening, the water keeping its stories. In the hush that follows, perhaps you will hear your own heart's small bell answering back.